Support for Consider This is provided by the University of Nebraska at Omaha College of Communication, Fine Arts, and Media.
Once again, from the studios of UNO Television on the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha, Consider This, a program of issues and information behind today's news.
You know, all of my life I've heard that a truly successful person, a really, really successful person, and even modestly successful, cannot run for public office. Just can't happen. And yet that's the kind of mindset that you need to make this country great again. So, ladies and gentlemen, I am officially running for President of the United States, and we are going to make our country great again.
Democracy can't be just for billionaires and corporations. Prosperity and democracy are part of your basic bargain, too. You brought our country back. Now it's time, your time, to secure the gains and move ahead. And you know what? America can't succeed unless you succeed. That is why I am running for President of the United States.
Hi everyone, I'm Kathy Wyatt. Welcome to this week's edition of Consider This. Our topic, the presidential election. Joining us to talk more about it are associate professors from UNO's Political Science Department, Gregory Petro and Jody Nethery Castro. Next to her, Thomas Sanchez. Thomas is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. Thank you all so much for being here and welcome to the program.
Thank you, Kathy.
Thanks.
It's nice to be here.
You bet. Greg, we're going to start with you and a brief history of Election Day in the United States.
I think the story of Election Day in the United States has to be the story of expanding the franchise. When American voters were first voting under the Constitution, the only people who were allowed to vote, of course, were white men who owned land, and people were not, did not vote at all for the president. The president was elected by the Electoral College. People did not vote directly for the U.S. senators at the time. Their U.S. senators were elected by their state legislatures. They would vote for the U.S. House of Representatives. And so, of course, over time, what's happened is that the franchise has expanded such that, most adults who, the most recent expansion was the lowering of the voting age from 21 down to 18. But anyway, I think that's the story of Election Day.
Okay, and Jody, the most historical Election Day in your opinion, and why?
Well, I think we're going to see it on November 8th, 2016. Why? Well, I don't think it so much has to do with the issues of the election campaign, because in some ways the two candidates that we have are not that different in what they stand for in the issues than their typical party candidates. I think it has more to do with the nature and personality of the candidates themselves, the rhetoric that's come out in this campaign. And I think the third thing is really that this election, from the standpoint of those of us who analyze politics and elections, is going to be one that is going to be hard to analyze from the standpoint of the way we traditionally analyze elections. So all the things that sort of help us predict outcomes in elections, like money in politics and things like that, don't seem to be playing out in the same way for this election.
So Thomas, what have you been drawn to? What captures your attention in this race?
Well, starting in 2008, a number of people were talking about the election being about race and gender, with first Clinton being the presumptive nominee for the Democratic Party, and then later on Barack Obama winning that nomination, then Sarah Palin being nominated for the vice president. But I think every election has been about race, class, and gender, because when you have all the viable candidates are white males, that's about race and gender, and we haven't seen someone run that's not from the upper class. So we still have to see that difference in terms of social class.
And Greg, about all those candidates, I mean, we had nearly 20. It was record-breaking, right? At the very beginning of this thing. How do you explain that?
You know, in political science, we think of elected officials as making strategic decisions. You know, which means that they have a certain kind of utility that they want to maximize. They have a certain kind of outcome they want to achieve, which is to, if you're ambitious, that is to, you know, ascend to sort of a higher office. Obviously, the presidency is the highest office. So, you know, what sorts of signals do people look for to take the White House away from the party that's holding it? Well, you know, you look for a weak economy, and you know the economy is growing at about 1% these days, or 1.5%. So that's not so good. The White House is easier to take away from the party after one party's held it for 8 years. So obviously we have that sort of situation. It's easier to take the White House when the president has approval that's below 50%. And in 2015, when people were making these decisions to get in, President Obama's approval was below 50%. So I think that a lot of strategic elected officials saw an opportunity to become president, and they all jumped in.
And one by one, they all stepped out. Right? Surprising to you in terms of who did what and when it came to folks withdrawing from this one by one?
Well, you know, you would expect that the more, you know, because the Republican Party is the conservative political party, you would expect that the more moderate candidates would get out sooner. And I kind of think you saw that. It wasn't a super consistent pattern, but I think you saw that a little bit. You know, I was certainly, I mean, I think if we're talking about, you know, what did I expect? I mean, I was very surprised that Donald Trump ended up being the nominee. So that you know, that completely caught me by surprise. I was shocked.
Well, surprising. You brought a couple of graphics, and we're going to put those up for our viewers. Let's talk for a minute about this rise of Donald Trump. Not only was he brought in, but people seem to be pretty pumped about him. And so let's talk about this perceived rise of Donald Trump.
Well, it helped Donald Trump that there were 17 other Republican candidates, or 16 other Republican candidates running for president. So I'm looking at the figure right now that everyone else is looking at. So there are companies that do content analysis of cable news. And so what they do is they're able to do a content analysis of the content on the news. And so people are able to measure how much of the airtime goes to the different candidates. So that would be the horizontal axis, you know, on the bottom, and then the vertical axis would be these candidates standing in the polls. You can see at the top between June of last year and April of this year. And it's, you know, these poll results come from pollingreport.com, which, you know, publishes and collects all of the publicly available polling results from the horse race polls. So you can see, I mean, the story here is pretty clear that Trump dominated, you know, both the cable news coverage and also, you know, had the plurality of the support, and that no one else really came close. And if we go to the next figure, it is a different way to look at the data that tells the same story. And so this data is from the same source. So the red line is the smoothed average of his coverage in the cable news. And then the gray is the smoothed average of his support among the polls. And you see that over time, they correlate very, very well together. And so you have a sort of situation where at the beginning with the 17 candidates, most voters didn't even recognize the names of most of these candidates. And so as a result, you know, Donald Trump came in with two advantages. One, he already had 90% name recognition among voters because he's a major American celebrity. I'm going to actually add on another advantage. So I'm going to go with 3 advantages. Second advantage is he had a reputation as being a very successful businessman. And then his third advantage, which he himself brings to the table, you know, with his characters, he's really good at getting media coverage. And so he was able to say things that attracted, he understands how the media works. He understands why the media is motivated to provide media coverage to what we might call colorful remarks or colorful content. And so by dominating the media coverage, he pretty much excluded any of the other candidates getting their names out there or being learned about. And so I think that explains the sort of patterns that you saw there.
Okay, and Thomas, then you bring in Hillary Clinton, right? Why these two, especially from a sociological standpoint?
So Trump is a little bit easier, I think, but I'm going to start with Clinton. I think you see, going back not too long, but 40 or 50 years, with all the social unrest in the 60s and 70s and all the social movements that came out of that, people that weren't previously in kind of the public arena, women and black people and Latinos and Asians and Native Americans, started getting educations and started voting. And so it's only a matter of time before we get a Barack Obama or a Hillary Clinton. With Trump, I think it's really a lot of fear based on two things, based on economic and demographic changes. Economic being that the manufacturing jobs that the lower class had previously used to enter the middle class are disappearing. In 1950, manufacturing was 35% of employment. It's now right about 8%. So those jobs are disappearing. At the same time, there's demographic changes. So whites have gone from roughly 80% of the population in 1980 to about 60, a little over 60% estimate for 2015. And so those people are left out of economic prosperity. Their economic situation right now is not good, and their prospects for the future are not good, and they need someone to blame. And so they blame the increasing numbers of Hispanics after September 11th. They blame Muslims. And Donald Trump comes out and he's saying, as Gregory said, he's saying all the right things. He comes in and he's saying the things that these people want to hear. So naturally they're drawn towards him.
Right, and then, well, Jody, you're nodding. Did you have anything you wanted to?
Oh no, I agree with what Thomas is saying. I think that it feeds into some of the ideas about what motivates sort of xenophobic and nationalistic rhetoric for politicians that rise on those kinds of fears. Yeah, okay. And we see it cross-nationally as well. I was just going to bring that in.
Okay, Craig.
I just wanted to add that I'm teaching political psychology here at UNO this semester, and we're talking about Donald Trump, and how he ended up being such an unusual Republican Party nominee. And the Gallup organization, they collect a lot of survey data, and so they have tens of thousands of random sample survey interviews, and they did an analysis where they correlated the zip codes people lived in with their support for Trump. And you would expect, and this goes back to Thomas, because we were sort of talking about, there's this threat, and the question becomes, is it a cultural threat or an economic threat? Economic meaning, like, is there actual competition? Like, are whites supporting Trump because they're actually in economic competition with immigrants? The cultural threat is more like, well, we think our values might change. We're concerned about, our hegemonic status as a group or that kind of thing. So they correlated these kinds of things, and they didn't find a correlation between, the sorts of contact people were having with immigrants and their support for Trump. And so what that suggests is that, and if people are more interested in this, they can look at Ezra Klein. He has some articles about this, and he writes for Vox. And he summarizes the study really well. So that suggests that it's more of a cultural threat that's motivating this. Also, most of Trump's supporters tend to be wealthier rather than working class. Wealthier people probably aren't terribly threatened by immigrants. So it seems to be more of a cultural threat than an economic threat.
Well, what's so interesting was people were so seemingly pumped about all this at the beginning, and then they turned a corner. I mean, anybody who's turned on the news lately understands that. And Thomas, I guess I wanted to ask you, so they vote a certain way, and now it seems as though people are backing up, right? So when, in your opinion, did that happen, and why?
Well, the why is easier because 18 months of campaigning, right? I mean, at a minimum 18 months, and really, some of these people have been, quote, campaigning for 4 years. So I think a lot of it is just fatigue. And then also, because that's so long, they might like a certain candidate for certain reasons, and then for lack of a better word, as the mud's thrown around, as the accusations are made, they start learning things about the candidate that they really like that are a little bit distasteful. And so their excitement or their energy, their motivation to really support this candidate goes down a little bit more and a little bit more each time one of those new, emails or old videos or whatever it is comes out.
Mm-hmm. Well, can I jump in here?
Yeah.
Well, you asked about the historic nature of this, of elections, and I mentioned that I think this is going to go down as historic. And I think part of this is these things that have come out. I mean, we've not seen this level of discourse, of discourse in around elections, I don't think, in my history of watching elections, to see, all of these revelations with women coming out saying that they were, either attempted assault or, some kind of unwanted sexual activity by a presidential candidate directed at them. That's unprecedented. On the side of Hillary Clinton, you've had these revelations that have come out about emails and the use of private server that have raised all these questions about how legal or illegal this investigation with the FBI. Then you've had these WikiLeaks revelations. So it's this idea of all kinds of information that may have been meant to be private and is in the public sphere and is the heightened emotions around all of this, and the questions of legal and illegal, and and again, the campaign fatigue that you mentioned, I think, because in this country, our election season is seemingly permanent.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't had this level of discourse, and it's frankly made it really tough to teach this election cycle, I think, because young people are easily disengaged when you have distaste and feeling like this is a system that I don't necessarily want to be a part of, or politics is dirty. These are the questions that we face as educators, I think. And even the idea of what are the rules of civility in the public sphere and how should we be presenting this to our young people. I know that there are rules about this in schools, and sometimes things that have happened in this election cycle don't even conform to the levels that we hold our young people towards in school.
So they're tossing these questions at you, and how are you, Jody, responding then? They're wanting to know. I mean,
Well,
it does put you in a tough spot, but what are you saying?
Yeah, it is tough. The thing that I keep trying to come back to is, let's model disagreements and differences in a way that allows people to air their differences and to have their differences and to respect each other's differences. I mean, we have always had political differences. I mean, this is a state that has Republicans and Democrats, Libertarians and Greens, nonpartisans, and nonpartisans are making up a big chunk of, I know in the district that I live in, I think something like a quarter of voters are registered nonpartisans. And so I think we have to try to I mean, maybe this is old-fashioned, but I try to harken back to a time when, we had to work across the aisle to get things done. I mean, our system is kind of designed to, to work that way. And so if we can't work that way, I sort of worry about what happens, the day after Election Day when somebody's got to be in there as president and has to work across the aisle to, or has to work across the branches to Congress, and you have to have members of Congress working across the aisle. And we have had traditions of that. We have kind of hyper-partisanship right now that is frustrating the ability to have stuff done.
I think this kind of brings in something else that I wanted to make sure we discussed today, and these are two people we're not hearing a whole lot about these days. We do have a graphic I want to put up, the vice presidential folks for our viewers. And Greg, I'd like you to talk a little bit about who these guys are and what role they're playing in this historic election.
People have studied to what degree does the vice presidential candidate affect voting for president? Doesn't really. There is a bit of a bonus. There can be. It's not consistent, but there can be a bonus when a presidential candidate picks a vice president from a certain state. There can be a vote bonus in that state. So we have, Tim Kaine and Mike Pence here. And Mr. Kaine is from Virginia, and Mr. Pence is from Indiana. And if you look at the polling right now, Secretary Clinton is doing very, very well in Virginia. So up until the Obama era, Virginia was really a Republican state, and it's sort of become a swing state now. But right now in this election, it's solidly in her column, and you wonder to what degree does that have to do with who she selected for vice president.
Jody, Thomas, anything more you want to say about those two gentlemen?
I don't have anything else.
Okay, so what Americans, Jody, think is one thing at this point, and boy, we've all heard our fair share of feedback, right? Let's go to what the world is thinking at this point, because there's certainly been talk to that. I want you to just open it up with summing up where you think we are right now in their eyes.
Well, I think that the United States plays sort of a disproportionate role on the world stage, both as an economic power, as a military power, just a world power overall. And other countries look to us to set a stage, for better or for worse, I suppose. It's hard, I think. We talk about sometimes in political science, we talk about the role of soft power. And soft power refers to our ability to influence other countries through non-military ways. And that influence often takes place because of the role that our values and our institutions and the way that they're perceived in other countries is taken. And so I think that one of the concerns is that other countries have been looking at this election as sort of an aberration and have wondered, where's the leadership that we're used to seeing of the United States, and are these sort of scandals that have come out during this election cycle harming sort of our image as a world leader in other places? I have had people ask me as I've traveled overseas, and this is anecdotal, but what's going on with your election, and questions of that type. And so the rhetoric, particularly the rhetoric from Trump on things like building the wall and forbidding all Muslims coming into the country, that kind of rhetoric is new, and I think it kind of sends a chill to some of our allies, and they ask questions about that.
So I'm going to head into another topic which we could probably spend an entire 30 minutes on, and that's social media, Jody. So take what you just said and magnify that, throw it all out there. How is that playing into this particular election?
Well, it was interesting to see the graphic that you had up earlier, sort of tracking the media coverage of the traditional media coverage through cable network of the candidates on the Republican side, because to some extent that plays into social media as well. I mean, what we've learned from this election cycle, I think, is that social media really matters, and that candidates have all mastered to some degree the use of social media in election cycles. You have, I'm thinking back to earlier in the campaign, you had, Bernie Sanders, who a lot of people did not expect to perform so well, really took off in sort of almost a kind of a grassroots kind of way through social media, and Feel the Burn, the hashtag Feel the Burn became a really, an important kind of a social movement through social media. Donald Trump has been excellent with social media. I mean, he's sort of, people love his unfiltered nature on social media, and so he's garnered all kinds of free media support. These are the kinds of things that feed back into what I was talking about earlier, which is that when we look at traditional ways of trying to understand and even predict elections through the use of money, I mean, Donald Trump didn't spend very much money in this election cycle. I mean, until very recently he's been putting money in, but he was getting a lot of free media coverage, and that included his social media role, which got traditional media coverage as well because of, what's he going to say next? What's he going to say next on social media? So I think that there's been some really interesting use of social media. And I should mention, other candidates as well have utilized social media in positive ways and have been able to, I think, one way or another figure out strategies with social media to maximize their coverage.
So Thomas, when we hear so much about this, what's important for all of us to remember, not just with this topic, but with any topic when it comes to social media?
Well, to me, it's social media, but also kind of along the same lines, really a fractured media, so that there's even what Jody referred to as the traditional media. You have Fox News having a certain bent, and CNN Fox News being known as conservative and CNN being known as more liberal, so that people are able to go to the media sources that they agree with, and they're not forced to look at issues or arguments from the other side, which they would have been previously, 30, 40 years ago, when media wasn't so fractured into these small little bits for each demographic group.
Okay, thank you. We have about a minute left. I want to give you each kind of a last word in like 15, 20 seconds, Greg.
Well, I guess, I was having a lot of thoughts during this discussion, but one of them has to do with the historical nature of this election, and you can't really judge history until time sort of moves on. And so the question will be, what will the impact be, in 2020 or 2024, or even in 2018, when what I mean by that is how will that we've really reached a new low in terms of tone, in terms of civility, and the question is just how will we move on from that, and what will the impact of that be?
Thank you, Jody.
I think that this election is going to be studied for a long time to come because of the role that gender plays in, and I think that you're going to see tremendous role that women voters play in terms of how the outcome comes.
Tom, briefly?
Yeah. So a neighbor of mine, based on his signs in his yard, has different politics than I do, but he's the nicest guy in the neighborhood. So I would like to encourage people to still be civil to their neighbors and not take what's happening in Washington back home.
Okay, thank you all so much. We do have a graphic that I want to make sure that we're putting up for our viewers in terms of the big day is, of course, November 8th, and there'll be lots of coverage. We would encourage our viewers to turn into the Knowledge Network here at 7 o'clock. I'd like to thank all of you for being here today to share your time and your expertise. Only time will tell. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all for watching. We'll see you next week.
Consider This is an issues and information program produced by UNO Television. More information can be found at unotv.unomaha.edu. If you'd like to share your comments about this show, call UNO TV at 402-554-2516 during regular business hours, or email us at considerthis@tvmail.unomaha.edu.